Welcome to the Digital Identity Digest, the audio companion to the blog at Spherical Cow Consulting. I'm Heather Flanagan, and every week I break down interesting topics in the field of digital identity, from credentials and standards to browser weirdness and policy twists. If you work with digital identity but don't have time to follow every specification or hype cycle, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. People who develop internet standards like consensus. That may be the least surprising sentence I have ever said in my life. I mean, consensus is one of those words that shows up everywhere in standards development. We talk about consensus calls, consensus decisions, rough consensus, sustained objections, whether the room agrees enough to move forward, whether the work has enough support to advance. And when the process is working well, consensus feels like it's almost elegant, right? A group starts with a messy problem, people bring different use cases, different deployment constraints, different business realities, architectural instincts, all of it. They argue, they revise, debate, compromise, and eventually a miracle occurs and a decision is reached that most people can live with. Maybe nobody gets everything they wanted. This is standards work, after all, not ordering from a very specialized architectural menu, but the group moves forward. The draft specification improves, everything is closer to publication, and the process, it works. That's exactly how it's supposed to happen. That is what is called the happy path. But the happy path is not, in fact, the only path. Sometimes consensus does not come easily. Sometimes it doesn't come at all. Sometimes the disagreement is not just a passing concern or a minor preference about wording. Sometimes someone believes the group is about to make a decision that is fundamentally wrong. And when that happens, most standards organizations have a way to escalate the disagreement. They may use different language to describe that. In the W3C, the mechanism I'm most familiar with is that of the formal objection. That's all capitalized, by the way. In the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, the language is usually about appeals. Other standards organizations have their own procedures for formal escalation when ordinary working group processes have not resolved the issue, but fundamentally this is what you get, right? Now, for simplicity, I'm going to use the word appeal here as a general term. When I refer specifically to the W3C process, I'll use formal objection. And the thing I want to say first and foremost is that an appeal is not automatically a failure of the process. It kind of feels like it, but it isn't. It's also not automatically an attack. And that can be really hard to remember when you're in the middle of handling one. If you are a working group chair, an appeal can feel really personal, right? You may have spent months or years helping the group move work forward. You've tried to keep conversations fair. You've tried to track all the issues, called the meetings, written all the summaries, listened to concerns, spent a lot of time, outside the formal settings to make sure that the conversation goes. And really, you've spent more time thinking about whether a particular sentence needs a must or a should or should just be removed. So when someone says to you formally, this is wrong and the result needs to change, it can feel like they're saying you failed. And maybe they even are saying something very close to that. But don't start there, right? An appeal is a process tool. It exists because consensus-based organizations need a way to handle serious disagreement. They need a way for someone to say, I cannot live with this decision, and have that concern reviewed by people who are not quite so deep in the weeds of the working group debate. This outside review is not an insult to the group. It is part of the system. Working groups are where technical expertise generally lives, and it's where the detailed discussion happens. They're where the contributors understand the history of the problem, the trade-offs, and the accumulated reasons why the text looked the way it does, which absolutely matters. You do not want every hard decision second-guessed by people who have not followed the work. But working groups can get very close to their own problems, right? And they can become tired, or they can get used to a particular compromise because it's been discussed so many times that everyone just wants it to be done. They can develop shared assumptions that are obvious inside the group, but not obvious outside it. And they can mistake exhaustion for agreement. And sometimes, someone outside the day-to-day argument can see something the group has stopped seeing. Doesn't mean the objector is right. This is important. An appeal does not create a veto. It does not mean the person objecting gets to stop the work simply because they feel strongly, but it does mean the concern is serious enough to be reviewed through the organization's formal processes. This is a really important distinction, right? A good appeals process should do several things at once. It should give the person objecting a meaningful path to challenge the decision. should also give the working group a chance to explain what it decided and why, and it should give reviewers enough information to understand the technical, procedural, and organizational issues, and ultimately allow the organization as a whole to decide whether the group's decision should stand. That is not failure, that's governance. It's not an exciting kind of governance, assuming such a thing exists, but it is a necessary kind. In the W3C, right, a formal objection is a serious escalation. It's not just a way to say, I am unhappy. It is a way to say this decision is wrong, the result needs to change, and here's why. Process then allows others to review the arguments for and against that position. They can look at the decision, the objection, the group's rationale, and the broader implications with a bit more distance than the working group may be able to have by that point, which is the value of having a process in the first place, right? It doesn't guarantee that the objection will prevail. It doesn't guarantee that the working group will be overturned. It does not guarantee that everyone will emerge feeling seen, heard, and spiritually renewed. This is standards work. Let's maintain reasonable expectations here. But it does mean that the objection receives a structured review, and the structure does matter. If you're a chair, the best preparation possible for an appeal starts, well, long before anyone uses the word appeal. It starts with basic, good process hygiene. Yes, that phrase is not going to sell conference tickets, but it is the kind of thing that saves you later, right? You need to make sure that you're tracking the issues, you're recording the decisions, you're capturing the dissent, you're making sure that people understand when the group is discussing, when it is deciding, and when a decision has been made. The objections need to receive substantive responses, not just the group disagrees, may be true, but it's not enough. A better record says, here's the concern that was raised, here's how the group considered it, here are the alternatives that were discussed, here's why the group chose this path anyway. Doesn't mean turning the working group into a courtroom. Please don't do that. Standards work already has enough procedural gravity. What I'm suggesting is you're creating a record that people can then follow, because if an appeal does happen, the reviewer needs to understand the sequence of events. They should not have to reconstruct the history from hallway conversations, meeting folklore, and the emotional residue of one particularly spicy GitHub thread. Documentation ultimately doesn't make everyone happy. It is not magic, but it can show whether the group has considered a concern fairly. It can show whether the decision was grounded in real discussion. It can show whether the chair was helping the group find consensus or just trying to get to the next agenda item before everyone lost the will to continue. That record protects the person objecting, it protects the working group, it protects the chair, and it protects the credibility of the standards organization as a whole. Another thing that the chairs need to remember is that the possibility of an appeal, or as some people might say, the threat of an appeal, should not control the group. Participants should know that a formal escalation is available. And in fact, I think chairs should be very, very clear about that when a group is approaching a decision that some participants probably cannot support. There's nothing wrong with saying, in effect, that the group appears to be moving towards this decision. If you believe this creates a serious technical or procedural problem that you cannot accept, the process gives you a way to raise that formally. That might feel like you're inviting drama. I don't think that's true. I think it's basically acknowledging the rules, because the threat of an appeal should not be a lever that changes how the chair runs the group. I mean, do not shortcut consensus because someone is threatening to appeal. Do not call a decision before you're ready because someone is threatening to appeal, right? Don't give one participant's concerns more weight simply because they have invoked process language, used capital letters, or suddenly made everyone on the call absolutely fascinated by the clock and wanting to just go home. What you want to do is help the group achieve the best decision it can. Make sure that the concerns have been heard and that the response is substantive, that the record is clear, and then just keep moving forwards according to the process. If the appeal comes, the group should be able to show its work. Now, for contributors, the advice is different but related. If you are considering an appeal, be clear about what you need. I mean, what decision exactly are you objecting to? Is your concern technical, procedural, or both? What harm do you believe will result if the decision stands? What change would resolve your objection? And what evidence supports your position? Simply saying, I do not like this outcome may be true, may even be understandable, but it is not enough if you're going through a formal appeals process. A stronger objection explains the decision being challenged, the reason the decision is unacceptable, and the change that would address the problem. The best objections do not rely on speculation about motives. They do not require everyone to agree that someone behaved badly. That's something that should be handled in a code of conduct. What the objections focus on is the decision, the process, the consequences, and the remedy. Argue the technical issue, argue the process issue, argue the implications. Go ahead for all of that, but don't attribute to malice any of these things, right? Don't try and pretend you're a mind reader. That's not going to work. And I know that can be difficult, right? Standards debate often involve real stakes, and companies may have products in flight, communities may have legitimate concerns about privacy, accessibility, security, competition, or deployability. People may have spent years of their lives trying to make sure a particular problem is not ignored. But an appeal will be stronger if it is disciplined, and that discipline helps everyone. It makes the concern easier to evaluate. It reduces the noise around the dispute, right? It gives people reviewing the appeal a clearer path to determine whether the original decision should stand. And sometimes the review might lead to a better outcome than either side expected. And, that's actually a part I think we should talk about a little bit more. Appeals can improve the standards process. A well-formed objection can force clarity. It can surface a real problem the group missed or underestimated. It can reveal the rationale for a decision was weaker than people thought, right? Or there may become a specific recommendation to improve the text, even if the underlying decision remains the same. Sometimes the best outcome is not that the objection wins or loses. Sometimes the best outcome is that the group clarifies the document, improves the security or privacy considerations, narrows the scope, adds a better rationale, or somehow explains the trade-off a little bit more clearly. And sometimes that means the objection will just be withdrawn because the concern has been addressed. That's not just a procedural, checklist. That's like the definition of success. Of course, not every appeal is helpful, right? Some come in late, some are weak, some try to reopen decisions that were already discussed quite thoroughly and openly. Some confuse "I did not get my preferred outcome" with "the process was broken." And some are more energetic than persuasive. That absolutely happens. But a process that only works when everyone behaves perfectly is not much of a process, right? Consensus-based standards organizations need ways to handle serious disagreement without pretending disagreement does not exist. They need a way to let a group move forward without allowing a single participant to block the work or hold it hostage, right? They need a way to review hard decisions without every decision turning into an endless procedural loop. It's a pretty difficult balance to find, actually, but it is necessary. And, this is a good reason why process documents exist for standards organizations. And the longer I work in standards, the more I appreciate the mechanisms that let people disagree formally. And it's not because I enjoy conflict. I do not, in fact, enjoy conflict. I enjoy clear agendas, good issue tracking, meetings that end early, right? I enjoy all of these things. But disagreement is part of the work, right? And serious disagreement is part of the work. The question is not whether standards organizations can avoid conflict, because they can't, we can't, I can't. The question is whether they can handle the conflict in a way that is fair, documented, and oriented towards progress. So, an appeal is not a happy path in the standard space, but it is still a valid path. And when handled well, it can leave the group, the standard, and the organization stronger than they were before. Something to think about. Thanks for your time. Tune in next week. We'll see what we talk about then. And that's it for this week's episode of the Digital Identity Digest. If it helps make things a little clearer, or at least a little more interesting, share it with a friend or colleague and connect with me on LinkedIn at HL Flanagan. And if you enjoyed the show, do be sure to subscribe and leave me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find the written full post at sphericalcowconsulting.com. Now stay curious, stay engaged, and let's get these conversations going.